Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for GMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we're discussing 10 powerful character abilities which often surprise new Dungeon Masters.
Now, you might hear a lot of discussion online about how a skilled Dungeon Master can handle just about anything the players throw at them. And that may be true, but we all have to learn somehow. And there are a lot of rules and abilities and nuances to the game of Dungeons & Dragons that a brand new Dungeon Master might not be prepared for or might not know about until they see it in play at the table. As a matter of fact, even reading the rules might not prepare you for actually what occurs when you see them in play.
If you're a new Dungeon Master preparing your first game or your first campaign, maybe running an adventure like Lost Mines of Phandelver, oftentimes when you read your adventure or prepare your game, you're imagining how things are going to go. But as any experienced Dungeon Master will tell you, the way that you imagine it's going to go during your game prep is never the way that it works out at the table. And sometimes you can be in the middle of a combat encounter that you thought was going to be challenging or interesting or exciting, and all of a sudden the player characters bust out a power, spell, ability, or other feature that you simply weren't expecting that really can throw you for a loop and sometimes can get some DMs even feeling a little bit tilted depending on how you experience other games.
Now, these 10 character abilities are not your players min-maxing. They are not them trying to break the rules. These are actually parts of the rules, and therefore you as a Dungeon Master should not try to avoid them, should not ban them, or should not try to nerf them at your table. These are just more things that you should be aware of and know if your party is using these features, these skills, these spells, these abilities, so that you can be better prepared for the implications that they have at the table. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
So the very first thing, and I see this all the time on online discussions, whether it's on Facebook, Reddit, our own comment sections, our Discord communities, it is Dungeon Masters that have a player character who has just got a fresh suit of full plate armor, strapped on a shield, and maybe taken something like the defensive or protection fighting styles, or maybe even knows the shield spell or the shield of faith spell, and has cranked their AC into the 21 to 24 range, or perhaps even higher. And surprisingly, this is something that characters can achieve at very low levels, even if they aren't given a suit of full plate from the Dungeon Master.
Now, the problem that this presents to a new Dungeon Master is that often when you're preparing early level combat encounters, you use a lot of minions and monsters that just get a +2 or +3 to hit, don't have any special abilities, are doing minimal damage anyway, but how is a creature with a +2 or 3 to hit supposed to compete with a 23 or 24 AC? Maybe a 21 they can hit once in a while, but they're still going to have to roll 18, 19, or 20 on the die in order to hit that. So a lot of times with these characters with very high AC, we find that it's very hard to challenge them at early level play for a new Dungeon Master.
What can make this situation even more challenging is that the other party members might not have an AC anywhere close to that. So the Dungeon Master feels a little bit cautious about reaching for monsters that have a very high attack bonus. Monsters' challenge ratings has to get really, really high before they even have a 50-50 shot of hitting a player with a 20 armor class. I think if you're looking for monsters with a +10 attack bonus or higher, you probably don't see that until you get to the giants at like around challenge rating 8 or 9. And if you have a party of 4th or 5th level characters, when it is entirely possible to have an AC of 20, you're not necessarily going to want to be throwing them up against fire giants, are you?
Now, a couple things that you can do to alleviate this or to work with this at your table is to always remember to diversify the types of monsters you're using. Yeah, having a really high AC is part of the fantasy that this player's bringing to the table. So having a swarm of minions gather around them, trying to hit them, and then bashing them away with their shield is fun for them. So don't be afraid to pile on some enemies against that high AC target. Yeah, you're kind of wasting those attacks, but that's fun for the player. At the same time, every so often, throwing in a minion or a monster that either casts a spell that requires a saving throw or has an ability that requires a saving throw is a great thing to throw at the players with high ACs to give them a challenge once in a while.
And if you wanted to, you could be really nasty and bring out something like a rust monster, but be careful with that solution because taking away the player's strength is something that often makes them feel frustrated and isn't actually fun for them. If your solution to challenging a player is putting them through a frustrating experience, that really doesn't create more fun at your game table. So oftentimes using monsters with alternative strategies, using more spellcasting NPCs and more spellcasting monsters can really be a good way to challenge those players with high AC. But it's also worthwhile using better combat tactics. Maybe the monsters are smart in knowing, hey, that tin can is hard to hit, so we're just going to surround him with some really tough foes or even other cannon fodder while they go for the more vulnerable members of the party as well. So this is a problem that you can address by both using a diversity of monsters, especially monsters with saving throws, but also mixing up your combat tactics and creating more diverse situations. It's very difficult because I will say at low levels of play, most monsters are going to be attacking player characters with their hit points by rolling to hit against their armor class. But if you look a little bit further past those in the monster manual, you'll find lots of great creatures to use instead.
As we move on to our second option, this is another one that players can achieve at very early levels that can surprise Dungeon Masters, and that's going to be stealth and invisibility. A rogue who stats themselves properly can have a plus 10 or higher to their stealth rolls. If you have a party with a rogue, a bard, and a ranger, and the rogue has that plus 10 already to stealth, the bard casts invisibility on the rogue, and the ranger casts pass without trace, adding an additional plus 10, and they're trying to sneak into your base that you have well guarded and you weren't expecting this, what are you going to do?
My solution? Embrace it. That is an amazing example of teamwork and your player characters to work together to overcome a difficult situation. So especially whenever you have a case where player characters are using their abilities together, recognize it for the teamwork that is happening during your game. And even when they are successful with it, they worked for that. They earned that. Don't take that victory away from them. That said, remember that stealth on its own is not like magical World of Warcraft invisibility. So you do need the invisibility spell to be invisible, and you do need to hide when you're invisible for your position to actually be concealed. And you as the Dungeon Master do get to use your sense of logic and reason when it comes to things like stealth and invisibility. It's not possible to sneak through a well-lit courtyard in the middle of the day when there's nothing to hide behind. It doesn't matter if your stealth bonus is plus 200. It can't be done because there's nowhere to hide. So remember that you as the Dungeon Master always get to decide if the conditions are appropriate, logical, and reasonable for the player characters to be able to hide or use stealth. That's a choice that you get to make. Well, the players get to be creative and propose their solutions. Ultimately, if you feel that it doesn't make any sense that this would work, that's within your rights to say.
There's a lot of video games out there where if you crouch in the tall grass, nothing sees you. And I think that as Dungeon Masters, we can't lean into that too far. I always think it's silly when I'm playing a video game and the monster walks right by me and I'm an inch away, but hey, my head's poking out, but I'm crouched. That's a little too silly. Your players can't just crouch in the tall grass next to the guard and have them turn around and not see them. They have to be a little bit more crafty and careful than that. So I think with a stealthy party, presenting options that they might use to infiltrate or get past the guards is exciting for them. But be aware of how stealthy your party can be. Always remember to be aware of the abilities that the monsters and minions that you're choosing have. I'd even low to mid-range play if you include something like a young dragon or any creature that has variations on the way that they can see, blind sight, tremor sense, true sight, or any of those. That's going to cause a problem for these stealthy characters, even if they have invisibility and pass without trace. They might get noticed. Again, use these sparingly, but they are a great way to say, oh, hey, my stealthy party has been stealthing in and out of every place for the last 3 or 4 levels. let's throw in a monster here that can actually see them and make them have to think a little differently in this mission.
That said, player characters that are using stealth are thinking of the world as a more vibrant, living, breathing place. They're not approaching every single group of monsters like a combat encounter that needs to be defeated. So if your player characters are being creative with their uses of stealth and they are thinking of ways to sneak past monsters, that is something that is worth cherishing in your players. Not every combat encounter has to be defeated by reducing the monsters to 0 hit points, and sneaking past them is a perfectly viable strategy. What your player characters need to learn, though, is that if they're going to sneak past the guards, they need to have an escape plan, because if they do raise the alarm, they're going to be in big trouble on their way out when the entire enemy base is alerted.
Now, similar to the AC problem, you can also have characters that at rather low levels can dish out a lot of damage. And a lot of times, DMs don't expect their low-level party to be able to kill a young dragon in 1 or 2 rounds, but it can happen.
For many Dungeon Masters, one of the first abilities that really throws them off with how much damage it can deal is Sneak Attack. And it may be surprising because the rogue is built around the idea that they can pull off this Sneak Attack every single turn on combat as long as they've got a little bit of planning and teamwork. But other abilities that allow characters, regardless of their build, to do a lot of damage are things like Eldritch Blast or the Paladin's Smite, fighters using Action Surge, barbarians dropping into a rage, and that's totally not discounting things like the Fireball spell or Spirit Guardians, or if your player characters take Great Weapon Master or Sharpshooter or use Hex and Hunter's Mark. All of these abilities let your characters do a lot of extra damage, and they're not really min-maxing just because they take these stronger abilities. It takes a lot more than that to really be considered a min-maxer in my books, but still, it can be a lot to cope with all these damage and can be very shocking when your bad guy gets one-rounded by the party.
Even to this day, as an experienced dungeon master, I still sometimes forget how powerful a party can be, and I'll put a group of minions in front of them that I think are going to challenge them, only to have my barbarian that has Great Weapon Master and a greatsword smash through 3 of them in 1 round, and then have the rogue kill the bigger bad guy with 1 sneak attack, and then a spell is cast that just dismounts the rest of them. And all of a sudden, before any of them got to go in combat, the combat encounter is over. This can still happen even when you're really experienced, and you need to be aware of what your players are capable of, what feats they're choosing, what spells they're choosing. And as always, be aware of the minions and monsters you're putting in front of them. If you have a paladin and a cleric in your party, and you put a demon with a bunch of skeletons, and then all of a sudden the cleric uses their Destroy Undead feature and the paladin smites the demon, and suddenly your combat encounter is over before everybody even got a turn to go. Be ready for that and know what you're putting in front of them and what their abilities can disable.
First, remember that when your player characters mop the floor with the bad guys, oftentimes that's a fun and memorable experience for them. So it is worth double checking to make sure, are your players having fun, before you have a knee-jerk reaction and think, oh, my combat encounters weren't hard enough. Because your player characters did expend their resources and did use teamwork and had fun defeating that combat encounter. So make sure that you double check those things before you start trying to diagnose a problem that you don't actually have. But then from there, if you still want to have a little bit more of a challenge for your player characters, consider, again, you can use monsters with a little bit of a higher challenge rating. You can stretch the bounds a little bit. And you can start off by just, if you're running a pre-written adventure, add 1 more monster of the same type to the combat encounter, or add a second wave of weaker enemies or a couple weaker minions. When you are planning your boss battles, you might want to take stock of how much damage your party members can do on average or on a critical hit, and just make sure that your boss has enough hit points to survive at least 1 or 2 rounds. And if your combat encounters are reaching 3, 4, 5 rounds, that's fine. A combat encounter that gets longer than that is actually a bit of a slog in many respects, and it's totally fine as long as every player character gets 2 or 3 turns. They're going to find that a satisfying experience.
I think in terms of a lot of these options, when you're thinking about countering these abilities, don't do it in every combat encounter. You want your players to have fun. I usually try to think of it that I'm going to throw minions and monsters that they are going to be good at killing 2 to 3 times before I think about challenging what they're good at. So every 3 to 4 combat encounters, think about how they are playing the game and think about what might counter the way they're playing, because it adds a fun challenge that forces the players to think different and come up with different unique strategies that actually expands the many options they have to play the game. But sometimes when your paladin is really good at smiting demons, you just want to throw a few demons in front of them to let them feel really powerful.
On the flip side of this, in addition to damage dealing abilities, one of the powers that player characters quickly start gaining, especially if they're spellcasters, spells which disable, control, or shut down their enemies. These can include spells like Hold Person, or even Web, or Hypnotic Pattern, Banishment, and even things like Counterspell. These spells are ones that you should be aware of exist in the game because they can really throw you off as a first-time dungeon master, especially when you've got a big bad evil guy who's going to launch a fireball at your party only to get counterspelled.
There has been more than one time that I've thrown a boss monster at my players that didn't have legendary resistance or legendary actions, and a simple banishment spell has ended those combats pretty quick. It's really important to just be aware of the spells that your party is choosing. If you have some monsters that have legendary resistance, then this is less of an issue for you because it means that they have to burn through those legendary resistances before they can actually debilitate the boss. And if they get to that point, then they've done a great job and they've blown through a lot of spell slots. But at earlier levels, not a lot of monsters have these abilities, and so a simple banishment or a counterspell against your evil wizard's big spell that they were going to use can kind of throw you off as a DM. Well, that was my big move that I was planning to start this combat encounter. The rest of their spells kind of suck, so now the show's over.
The best way to handle this is to just be prepared for it to happen. I recommend that as a new Dungeon Master, whenever your players do gain a level, do that at the end of a game session or in the week between sessions, rather than at the beginning of a new game session. This will give you time to review your player characters' character sheets and read up on the new spells and features that they're gaining as they level up, so you can be prepared for them to happen. And that goes hand in hand with our next point about misconstrued, confusing, or difficult to interpret spells as well. These include spells like Illusion Magic, or spells like Phantasmal Force, or the Suggestion Spell, or even player characters trying to do things like use Create or Destroy Water to destroy all the water in a human being's body, which doesn't do that at all, but sometimes players will try this, especially if they're new to the game. Having this extra bit of time between your game sessions when your player characters select and gain their new abilities will just give you that opportunity to prepare for it by reading the abilities.
And when you as the Dungeon Master read a new spell that your player characters have chosen, talk to them about that spell if you think there might be a misinterpretation or some confusing language. Not every spell is exact in its wording. It's very helpful to read the spell description out loud and always tell yourself this spell should do exactly what it says it does and usually nothing else. There is an asterisk there that I will say, if a player character comes up with a really creative solution on the spot that uses the spell in a unique way that might not be in the text, but that solves a really cool problem in a really unique way, sometimes the rule of cool takes hold and you just got to go for it. I had a player the other day cast Entangle to stop an object that was about to fall down a grate. And they cast Entangle on the floor to catch it, and not the usual use of Entangle, but I was like, hey, you're using a spell slot, you're using a resource, and you're solving a problem. Why not? But for a lot of these really confusing spells, you should read it out as a DM, think about what you interpret it as, and if it's confusing, have a conversation with the player about how they may have interpreted it, and see if you can meet in the middle and come to some common ground on how it's going to work at your table.
We've created a lot of videos clarifying some of the most difficult to use spells in D&D 5e, but also you should be aware that there is an official errata document as well as the Sage Advice Compendium, which has commonly answered questions to many of these confusing things. These are available on the the official D&D website, and we'll have the links in the description below. I really recommend, as a new DM, that you print these out and keep them with your Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide, because they are a really handy reference for answering some of these questions if they come up during play.
Keep in mind that you, as the Dungeon Master, have the final say in all of the rules and how they work at your table. If there's a disagreement at the table, make a ruling and move on. You can even tell your players, this is how I'm ruling it now. I'm going to read up on this and we'll talk about it at the next game session. Most of the time the players are okay with an answer like that, and if they are starting to argue, you just say, that's how I'm ruling it. We're going to move on for now, but let's check it out at the end of the game session.
And if you make a mistake, if you make a bad ruling, we all have done it. It's totally okay for you to say to your players, I know it worked that way that time. I made a mistake. In the future, it's not going to work that way anymore. That is totally fair of you to say. You are not beholden to the past decision that you made, especially if that wasn't necessarily the best ruling or the best decision for your game or for your players as a whole. Getting the rules right and finding what works for your table is always going to be a little bit of a negotiation between you and your players.
And speaking of negotiations, the next option that we're talking about is going to be characters who are very charismatic. They might have a high persuasion, deception, or intimidation skill. And as a lot of new DMs enter the game, one of the things that is actually hardest to do as a DM is say no to your players thinking of something fun that they want to do. But once in a while, you do have to set where the bar is and set the rules in place. And with characters that have an exceptionally high persuasion, we as DMs can sometimes fall into the trap of allowing them to get away with murder just by having a really high roll on persuasion. The guards find your bard standing over a dead guard and they start asking questions, and the bard's like, I have no idea how this, or that would be deception, but I have no idea how this happened. And they roll like a 25 on deception, and we as DMs go, oh, 25, that's a really high roll. I guess the guards believe you, and now they're going to start investigating who could have killed this person while you're holding a bloody knife. Probably not going to fly, and we as DMs need to address this at the table. A high persuasion, deception, or intimidation score should not work the same as casting suggestion or other mind-altering spells. You need to use your logic in these places and remember that these are people seeing and experiencing the world that you're creating at the table. And so if the guards walk up and see the bard holding the knife with the dead body in front of them, there's not really time for questions unless they come up with something really, really convincing that you as a DM go, actually, that could fly. They could buy that. I still need a deception roll, but I'm looking for a 20 or higher to buy your well thought out story.
The other way this happens all the time is player characters haggling with an NPC to get a bigger discount at the shop, which can sometimes just be so frustrating when your players do it all the time. Or when the player characters are trying to negotiate or persuade an NPC to do something that they would never actually do. You might have a bard that has a very high, like a +10 on persuasion or something, and they can get very high results. Or in alternate cases, maybe your player characters come up with a very logical, airtight sounding argument when they're negotiating with a player character. And in this, I'd just like to say that sometimes there's different styles of persuasion. Not every argument can be won with a perfectly logical argument. Sometimes people are swayed over by emotional arguments or ethical arguments. And so player characters often expect non-player characters to always behave in a perfectly logical way. But people don't always behave in a perfectly logical way.
Monty can tell me that he thinks that the sequel Star Wars trilogy is garbage, and I will get angry and try to defend it, even though he makes really valid points on why it's bad.
And you can't convince me how delicious it is. I'm never eating a banana split.
And sometimes an NPC that the player characters are arguing with have their ideals, bonds, flaws, and personality traits that they will stick to no matter what. And that's just sometimes how it works in D&D. You could roll a 30 on persuasion to try to convince me of something that I very strongly believe. And even if you're right, my belief in it might not allow that 30 to get through.
As you gain more experience as a dungeon master, you're going to realize that it's you that gets to decide when the dice are rolled. And if there is a situation where it doesn't matter what the player character's argument is, they're not going to be able to convince an NPC, it's better to just not ask them to roll the dice at all. Oftentimes, as a new Dungeon Master, players will demand to make a persuasion check, and you can simply say, I get to decide that, not you. I'll ask you to roll the dice, I'll ask you to make the check if it's called for and if it's warranted. And this is one of those things that you'll learn over time as a Dungeon Master, that you don't always need to make everything about a dice roll. Sometimes you can use your sense of logic, your sense of judgment, to decide whether the player characters have won the NPCs over, maybe without rolling the dice, or whether they won't ever be able to convince them of the point of view that they have. So it is up to you, and if there is no chance for the player characters to succeed, don't roll the dice. That said, that's a skill that you will learn over time, and I still make mistakes with it too.
And I think at the same point, if your player characters are doing really compelling role play at the table, that's also a time that you might not need to ask for a dice roll. If the player who is playing the bard really gets into character, comes up with a compelling argument that speaks to the personality of the NPC they're talking to, at that point, it's kind of just nice to give it to them. And I think as we move on to our next point, a lot of these same ideas apply. And this is characters that have exceptionally high perception. Now, we talked about the sort of negotiation skills. Perception is much the same. A lot of player characters will have a +10 to perception, and they'll say, oh, I want to see if there's a trap door anywhere on the floor here. Oh, I rolled a 30 perception, so you have to tell me, DM. Well, no, you don't. Is it something that they could perceive from where they're standing? A high roll on perception is not the same as having true sight or being able to detect hidden objects. You can't do that with perception. You could have the best passive perception in the whole game. I have a character at my table right now. The wizard has a passive perception of, I believe, 20 or so. And every once in a while, I like to give them something and say, hey, you have a really high passive perception, so you notice this before anybody else. But usually when I'm asking for a perception roll and that player says, my passive perception is 23, does that come into play here? I say, well, in this case, you're actively looking for something that is hidden, so no.
Remember that as a DM, you are your player character's eyes and ears. What you describe to them sets the scene and tells them what their characters are able to see and hear in the environment around them. And you have to make sure that you give your player characters a good description. I like to make sure that I hit all 5 of the senses when I'm describing a location. So what they see, what they hear, what they taste, what they smell, what they touch, what the temperature is like, if it's humid, give them a real feeling for that. And it's always better to give your players more information and more description than not enough. I like to save the perception skill for when my player characters take a very intentional act to examine something in the environment and look around somewhere and explore. If they do have these high perception checks, that lets them feel like they are the investigator, like they are the Sherlock Holmes exploring through the environment. And I do like them to ask them to be specific with what they're looking for. Remember, don't gate essential information behind a single perception roll. If that'll bring your plot to a dead stop because the players didn't roll 20 on perception, you might want to revise your storyline just a little bit there. On the flip side of it, sometimes new DMs can be frustrated with players that have a very high passive perception because they never get to ambush them. And to that I would say, there's more to a great combat encounter than an ambush. If your players have done things like take alert or observant or have other class features that prevent them from being surprised, they've invested that in their character to protect them in a certain way, and they should get that, the benefits of that. Not every combat encounter has to begin with the player characters getting ambushed, and as you gain more experience as a Dungeon Master, you'll find that you rely on ambushes less and less and less as a compelling way of starting a combat encounter anyways.
Now, the next player option that we're looking at is flight. Flight is something that is very readily available to a lot of different player character options in the games of D&D and often at low levels. At this point, there's even races that you can choose that give you inherent flight. There are a lot of subclasses that grant you flying abilities at 5th or 6th level or somewhere around there. And there's spells for flight and different magic items for flight and all sorts of ways that your player characters can fly. Again, if this is happening at your table, it's something that you should embrace and allow. If they have invested in the option to fly, that might be great for them, and that might be really exciting for them. Now they can solve a lot of problems. But what you don't want to do as a DM is forget that they have flight. And when you're planning your encounters, your puzzles, your traps, and your dungeons, and you design an entire elaborate scheme of a clockwork puzzle that they need to interact with in order to open the stairs to the upper level, and then you forget that they can just cast fly and bypass that entire puzzle, again, that's problem solving. And if you knew that they had flight and that's an option for them, then you're ready for it when they say, we cast fly, and you say, yes, they did the thing that I thought they would do. But if you completely forgot that they have that option, it can be kind of upsetting at the table when they bypass all of the stuff you've planned because they can fly.
As a rule of thumb, when you are designing your combat encounters, make sure that there is at least 1 or 2 enemies in that combat encounter that can make good ranged attacks. This is a huge thing that we often miss out on, and oftentimes we often don't realize that there are many monsters that seem like melee brutes that actually have really good ranged attacks. There are monsters like hill giants who can pick up a rock and throw it. And even ogres have things like javelins, or there's the variant ogre with the giant ballista. Bring more monsters that have ranged attacks. In fact, I would say if you're having trouble challenging your player characters as a new dungeon master, look at how often you're using monsters with ranged attacks, because that is one of the first things that you can do to make combat more challenging, because a monster with a ranged attack can, not only can they shoot the flying Aarakocra, but they can also shoot past the fighter with the big shield at the squishy wizard. And so ranged attacks are a big way of just transforming your combat encounters. And just the next adventure that you plan, just say, I'm going to make sure that half the monsters in every single combat encounter are primarily ranged attackers, not melee attackers. It will really up your combat game.
Something similar to flight that we also need to address here is teleportation. Basically, every spellcaster in the game gains some form of teleportation if they choose it. And again, there are now subclasses and features that allow certain characters to teleport at will or as an action, or many different options for maneuverability through walls or around obstacles or past traps. Similarly to flight, this is just something that you want to be aware of. We've talked about this before in this episode, but if you're reading the spells that they choose, looking at the abilities they're gaining, then you know how to prepare your upcoming dungeons and puzzles. Again, you don't need to disable these abilities or undo them, but as a matter of fact, a great thing that you can do is, if you know that your party has several options for flight and teleportation, design a dungeon that requires them to use flight and teleportation to get past certain parts of it. Now you're playing with the abilities that they've chosen and making them use them, rather than, again, putting a secret staircase that they need to unlock, but they can see the level above and they can just teleport them and the crew up there. That's going to ruin the whole puzzle. But if you make it so there is no secret staircase and the staircase is broken and there's no way that they can see getting up there, they may be able to climb and drop a rope down, or fly, or teleport.
It is worth remembering that many of the teleportation spells, like Misty Step, have a limited range, require line of sight, and at least at low levels, only allow one character to go at a time. It's not until you actually get Dimension Door that characters can bring other characters with them and teleport somewhere where they don't have line of sight. And sometimes this can get the player characters in over their heads. For example, a player character might get crafty with Misty Step and say, I want to look through the keyhole and teleport to the other side. And they might do this, but they might not be too happy about that when they realize that they just teleported into the orcs having lunch. And now they are lunch. So sometimes it is worth showing player characters, hey, yeah, you've got this flight, you've got this teleportation, but if you use these abilities alone, because often at low levels, there might only be 1 or 2 characters in the party that can use these features, and if they go off on their own, if they split their party, that can be risky for them because they run the chance that they're going to get attacked by enemies that they can't handle on their own.
Lastly, a very popular player option is to bring along familiars, summons, and companions. Again, a lot of subclasses in the game and a lot of classes feature the ability to have an animal companion or build a companion. or the option of taking Find Familiar. There's also a lot of great spellcasters who have access to the many summoning spells available in the game. Some of these spells we've talked about in previous videos can be mildly problematic for bogging down play at the table. That's only one of the concerns that you're going to have as a dungeon master when you have a bunch of people with familiars, summoned animals, companions, all acting at the table. Not only is this going to slow down play, but it's also going to upset the entire balance of how you're creating combat encounters in the game. You might plan for a group of monsters that have a challenge rating that threatens a low-level party, not accounting for the fact that your Beastmaster Ranger has a pet wolf, your Battlesmith Artificer has their companion, you have a Druid who has just summoned a bunch of deer onto the table, and you have 3 of these characters have familiars flying around causing the help action or, carrying items or whatnot between the player characters. The shenanigans can get off the charts if you have a bunch of this stuff happening at the table.
And often cases, these are characters' inbuilt abilities, which don't really factor into changing the challenge rating calculation because these are just the spells and attributes that players get. But all of a sudden, you just have twice as many player characters in the initiative tracker. One simple house rule to sort of handle this is to always rule that if the player characters have any companions or familiars or summons, that all those creatures, rather than rolling initiative for them separately, just have them act immediately after the player characters who controls them. It's a simple rule. It doesn't hurt anything. It makes it way simpler for me to manage personally. And I also feel... And that usually solves a big piece of the logistics and organization problem when it comes to these sort of creatures. But oftentimes player characters will use them in interesting ways outside of combat, like having a summoned monster or a familiar scout the dungeon ahead of time. And this can be very surprising, especially for new dungeon masters who might not realize that a wizard can see through the eyes and hear through the ears of their familiar from 100 feet away. And if you're not prepared for this, the wizard at first level can scout your dungeon.
That is something that's happened to me. It's happened to Monty, and it is always a little bit of a surprise until you are aware that your player characters are going to do this. But if you have a base with secret operations happening and something happening on the top floor of a tower in a castle, and the wizard just sends their owl familiar to spy through the glass or look in through a window or scout the entire dungeon, then you need to be prepared for what's going on in those places, and it can actually throw you off. I remember an example where Monty used Arcane Eye, which is a spell, but similar idea. This was probably in my first few months of DMing, and I can tell you I didn't really know what to do at that point. I wasn't skilled enough to know that the monsters can move around, that maybe I should have put a spellcaster in there or some sort of defensive spell that made them aware that something was spying on them. There were a lot of options that I would learn over time that could have better prepared me for this. But at a very early stage in my DM career, Monty cast that spell, scouted the whole dungeon, and I was like, well, I'll just remove all of the cards I had blocking the dungeon. Here's where all the monsters are. Have at it, I guess. It was still really fun for the players, which is also something I had to learn, that my players actually really enjoyed being able to scout that dungeon ahead of time and using that to their advantage and plan their attack accordingly. And I think that's a big lesson for all new DMs, is that a lot of times when you feel like you're being outdone, keep in mind how much fun the players are having. That's really important, and sometimes you need to realize that the whole point of them using all of these abilities, choosing these spells, having these features, is because they want to have fun with them at the table, and they want to use them to outdo the scenarios that are being presented.
Ultimately, finding joy in your players' creativity, success, and victory is a big part of the learning curve of a dungeon master. Your player characters will find innovative ways to thwart your best laid plans. It is just part of being a dungeon master. And usually it just helps to know that these things are coming, be prepared with them so that you can roll with the punches and still throw a couple unexpected curveballs along the way. It's not necessary to ban these options, to shut down your player character's choices, to tell them that these things aren't going to work. In the worst case scenario, maybe your player characters trounce the dungeon, wreck that dragon in 2 rounds, defeat the necromancer super easily, but probably they had a really good time doing it, and that will still be, and they're going to remember their victory and how awesome they felt doing that cool thing, not, oh, that was easy. And then next time you can think of new ways to challenge them in the next dungeon as you learn over time how to better address the amazing things that player characters can do in D&D 5e.
So this has been a look at 10 powerful character abilities that surprise new DMs in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Feel free to share stories of some of the pitfalls or lessons that you've learned along the way of being a DM in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible with the incredible generosity of our Patreon community. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider joining our Patreon by following the links in the description below.
And if you want to see us try to thwart Monty's every plan, you can watch our live play in The Fate of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
The rules of D&D 5e are quite tricky, but fortunately we've got lots of great guides for Dungeon Masters on how to handle it. Check out our playlist right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.